Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Williams. I'm on the student board of the Buckley program. The Buckley program is dedicated to the promotion of intellectual diversity on Yale's campus. The Buckley program hosts lectures, debates, and conferences with guests who hold views that diverge from the campus orthodoxy and challenge Yale students on their principles. The freshmen and upperclassmen who are not yet involved in the Buckley program but would like to learn more should visit buckleyprogram.com to learn about becoming a Buckley Fellow. And now to introduce our guests for the afternoon. Ken Stern is the president of Palisades Media Ventures in Washington, D.C. His most recent book is called Republican Like Me, How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right. Mr. Stern is a graduate of Yale Law School and is a former CEO of National Public Radio. Mike Pesca is a radio correspondent for Slate Magazine and is the host of Slate's daily podcast, The Gist. He is a recipient of 2 Edward M. Murrow Awards for radio journalism and has written for numerous publications, including Slate and The Washington Post. In 2014, an executive producer at Slate called him one of the most interesting, exciting on-air personalities working today. Our guests will be discussing political discourse within bubbles, campus politics, and partisanship in the Trump era. Please join me in welcoming them.
Oh, okay. Cool.
So for an opening question, so how do you guys both think that news media has changed over the past year? And what do you think the effects of increased partisanship have been on the types of news media you're each most familiar with?
Well, you're actually part of the news media,
Sure.
which I'm not formally anymore. So
Yeah.
You want to take that?
Yeah. First of all, Ken was my boss at NPR for a number of years, so it's really good to be able to parry with him without having my job on the line, because he was known as the hangman.
Yeah. It always kept people from talking at
yeah.
NPR. Yeah, that was, yeah.
There.
Yeah.
Spare the rod. Literal rod in a glass case in his office. The guy was something. So the first way it's changed is it's totally increased the fortunes of news media, and networks that were not doing well and seen as maybe laggards within their major corporate overlord subdivisions. Now they're doing quite well, and it's almost to the point where if you're just smart enough to point the camera at Donald Trump or retweet his tweets, you're going to make some money and get some traffic. But let's go a little bit deeper. I think that it was a bit surprising to me. So I guess the construct of we have a generally liberal media in places like MSNBC and a generally conservative media in places like Fox, and CNN would say they're in the middle, but most conservatives would disagree, and I don't know what most liberals would say. But let's just take Fox. There was a time when a year ago, if you said to me, project out, maybe a little bit more than a year ago, project out how Fox would be covering the candidacy of Donald Trump, the presidency, I would say it's a little bit of an open question, because you have the Murdoch children who seem to be somewhat opposed to just doctrinaire Trumpism. So let's see how it goes. They're going to be, things will dictate their coverage. And the fact that they've fallen in line to such a degree, with some notable exceptions like Shep Smith, but the fact that they've fallen in line and are no longer really advocating for a conservative worldview on their opinion shows, but a Trumpian funhouse mirror on their shows, is a little bit surprising to me. And as David Brooks noted just the other day, though, it's really a boon time for conservative writing. The National Review's never been better. The Weekly Standard's never been more important. And I think that's true. I think it's vital. I think it's also been, what Trump has done is he's been a little bit of a touchstone and a litmus test for guys like David Frum, who I wouldn't be listening to as much if anyone else was president. And I listen to him and I say, well, he's pretty brilliant on the issue. So that's another effect that I didn't anticipate that the last year would have.
Yeah, so I agree with all that. And I'll start with agreeing with the business. The New York Times went over $1 billion in subscription revenue. Donald Trump likes to talk about the failing New York Times. He's fabulous for the New York Times. And the New York Times is kind of fabulous for him. They actually have this sort of vicious cycle, let's call it, where they both virtue signal to their own audiences, the Times by knocking Trump, and Trump gets a fantastic boost with his base by knocking the news media. And it goes back and forth in ways that I think are actually pretty good for each of them individually, fairly unhealthy for the democracy. I'm going to make an argument here, which I think is going to be a little overstated. But this is what the heck in the context of this kind of conversation. I think it's worthwhile. I think we will look back 25 years from now and say this was a pivot point for the future of the news media. And that was the beginning of the end of this notion of impartial journalism, or even the pretense of impartial journalism. And I say that not because I think there's Fox on one side and New York Times on the other side. That's a false equivalency argument. But the idea of media being down the middle, saying stories from both sides is really a 20th century construct. That's not the way journalism started in this country. And I think it's moving back towards original roots, which is much more about advocacy journalism, much more about partisanship. And that happens slowly, one story at a time. But I think in the long lens of history, we'll start to see where news organizations can understand my audience is on one side of the issue, sort of one side of the partisan divide, not the other, and I can succeed by catering to them. And that has, that's not just about what's covered, but sort of the substantive tone of it. That doesn't happen one way. It's not like the New York Times all of a sudden decided we're going to be anti-Trump, pro-Democrat. We're going to be the Democratic House organ. But I think over time, that's what we're going to see. And I think that shift has started to a certain extent.
Although I would say that the two greatest beneficiaries of Trump and the two greatest exemplars of journalism, the Washington Post and the New York Times, definitely still see themselves as bastions of impartiality. Everyone, I guess, would disagree. But then again, the New York Times will do stories where, today Maggie Haberman reported a great story on where the Trump inauguration money went. It's just plainly factual and I think eye-opening. They'll try to do a story where they humanize a Nazi and get a lot of guff from it from the right. Just because you get guff from the right and left doesn't mean you're in the middle. And I don't think they'd say they're in the middle. But look at the Roy Moore story in Alabama. I think 14 of the 16 victims were unearthed by, I say victims, accusers, were unearthed by either the Times or the Post. So our two best journalistic organs, our two most vital, the ones that, don't kid yourselves, every cable news show bases their bookings on. Like if you just stripped away those two newspapers, even Fox, half of their coverage would be different, and certainly CNN and certainly MSNBC. They still see themselves as essentially, I don't know if they'd say centrist or both sides, but they see themselves as fair, and they see it's very important to be fair. Now, maybe a place like I work, Slate, would all say, we're fair because, we call out racist as racist. I think it's a different kind of fair. I think they're maybe intellectually honest at Slate, but they're definitely not avidly trying to present the conservative side. So I don't know. I mean, look, in the past 20, you said this will be seen as an inflection point. I mean, we're always at a crossroads, I think, in the media. I don't know what was the era we could look back in the past 25 years, just because everything's so much faster. There's the Filer-Faster theorem where things happen so much quicker than they ever have. Like every year is somewhat of an inflection point. I don't know when the Pax media occurred.
Well, so fair enough. Up to a point, right? So nothing I will say is to suggest that the New York Times, so I think you're right. The New York Times and the Washington Post are journalistic institutions unlike any other in the country, and they play a specific role. I think, though, that role is changing, and it doesn't change overnight that they, what is a newsroom dedicated to the sort of journalistic creed, we tell stories without fear or favor, both sides of the story. That doesn't change overnight. But I do think it changes slowly. Just as the country has changed. I mean, part of the reason media does not work in a vacuum, and that is the country is far more partisan than it used to be. People take sides, and this is really what my book's about, take sides in ways they didn't. People identify with themselves politically. And I think journalists, I hear journalists are people too. Mm-hmm. And I think they inherently are choosing side. They may fight that. In their day-to-day coverage. I wrote a story for Vanity Fair just before the election, and I just picked, and it's a slice of time article. I took one issue of the Washington Post, and showing I'm an old guy, it was delivered to my doorstep, and I picked it up, and I opened it up, and I read every article on Donald Trump that day. 21 articles. Every single one of them was negative. This was right before the election. That was in the front page, that was in the style section, that was in the Metro section, that was in the sports section. Not in the food section. There was no coverage of Donald Trump in the food section. The only section didn't cover him that day. And I think there's something to be said. I don't think anyone sat down and said, we're going to write 21 negative articles on Donald Trump. But the collective wisdom of the newsroom was, there's 21 negative things to say about Donald Trump, and God knows there are at least that. But that's a perspective that I don't think would have happened in another different time. And that's about who works there. And I just think that it's going to be part of a greater sort of conflict oriented society around the partisan divide. And that's, I mean, to me, that's a worrisome thing. Because I don't think that is a genie put back in the bottle very easily.
Look, then again, how could you say that the 21 articles about Donald Trump were inaccurate? Or you're not saying that.
I'm
but
not. No.
They're deserved. On that day, there might well have deserved to be 21 or 29 or 121 negative articles about Donald Trump. And by the way, I hear the Taco Bowl in Trump Tower is not that good. So there could have been a food article.
That was a different day. I'm sure it was.
It's very hard to get an accurate reading of the media based on their coverage of this sui generis figure who skews everything. And just being negative about Trump, I mean, if you were negative about George Bush, or if all your articles about Hillary Clinton were positive, then I'd say there's something that's a problem. But consistently pointing out that the man who violates norms to such a degree and is just so untruthful. I mean, newspapers fact check and they issue corrections, and he's averaging 3 lies a day. So that's at least 3 articles that you should do and commission to reverse those lies. It's very hard to use him and to use where you stand in relation to Trump as any sort of barometer or Geiger counter or litmus test, or I'm out of analogies.
Yeah, so that may be right. So Trump may leave at the end of 4 years, 8 years, maybe change the Constitution in 12 years.
Yeah.
And we revert to pre-existing norms, because he is one of a kind, a singular character division. I kind of hope so, but I have a feeling that he is the kind of character that actually, I mean, that's why I'm sort of, this is predictive, right?
Yeah.
It's not like this is the way it's definitely going to be. It's me sort of looking at and saying, I think he is a signal of things to come. And once you get used to it, I mean, you're making the normative judgment, which I personally agree with, and most people on this campus would agree with, that Trump deserves 21 negative articles a day. But 40% of the country or more disagrees with that.
Yeah.
And that becomes a representation. I mean, it's a factual argument. We could argue about whether he deserves it or not. But it's a issue in which the news media represents a particular faction of the country, with a particular political perspective. Now, that genie may get put back in the bottle. That's the analogy I kept using. But I'm guessing that it doesn't, because it's also, as you say, good for business. And people follow the money.
But I don't know just Trump negativity is good for business. I think Trump coverage, and I haven't had to look too far. Look, I get the print editions of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and I pay for the Washington Post. And I stopped paying for the Boston Globe because I already listed 3 papers that I'm reading all day. I didn't have to look too far for them bending over, to be fair, at times to Donald Trump. He announces this infrastructure plan. Right, this is the 4th time he's had an infrastructure week. You might think a bunch of journalists, even the ones who consider themselves fair-minded, would say, fool me 3 times, I'm not going to be an idiot. But you know what? They all did coverage on the infrastructure plan. They all quoted experts who would say, here's where it may work, here's where it won't. I've been reading, infrastructure experts saying, well, he's not going to be able to rebuild airports because of all these regulations. But it's like, I just think that those 3 big, important vestiges of journalism that we mentioned might have done 21 bad articles on Trump that day, but in fact, they're really being fair often, consistently, fairer than maybe Donald Trump has demonstrated that he deserves.
Oh, well, that's what fairness he deserves. And so I thought you were going to say sort of the fairness that Donald Trump himself offers, which is an entirely different topic.
Right,
and,
right.
But I think there's the consequence. So let's actually talk about a little bit of the consequences of sort of the voice, which is, because I think we keep going around, does he deserve horrible coverage? And I think we'd probably end up agreeing mostly that he does, just on sort of our own take on it. I think the challenge here is sort of, to me, and really where I'm concerned about, and really what my book is about, is the consequences not for what we think, but for that 40% of the country, maybe more, most of them who live in different parts of the country, many of them a different background, seeing a sort of common purpose with us, and seeing that they're locked out, they're not reflected, and that's a little bit about media, but it's also about the political parties, the establishment, sort of the future vision of the country. What I'm increasingly worried about is the notion we are working against sort of two very different visions of the future, and people increasingly angry at each other, which I think is a sort of a scary outcome that I don't think we worry about enough, because we're all locked in this day-to-day. Is that infrastructure plan as stupid as we think it is? How could he sandbag the immigration plan today? Those are important things. Those are important stories. But I think it loses the bigger arc, which is, I think, sense of disintegration as a country. The sense that we're in it together, that we have sort of assumption of good faith on the other side. I don't think that's increasingly in decline, and to me, very worrisome.
So the name of your book was Republicans Are People Too. No, what was the name of your book?
It's up with people. So it's called Republican Like Me, a takeoff on the book Black Like Me, where I sort of, as a lifelong Democrat, spent a year.
So appropriation.
Yeah, exactly right. That's right. That's right. Exactly right. All sorts of things, appropriate all sorts of things. And then how I left the liberal bubble and learned to love the right. And that, for me, just to sort of...
And that's a takeoff on Dr. Strangelove,
It
right?
is. You're the only one who gets that. Right. And it's, that's why it's a bad title, because it's a takeoff on things that only Mike Pesca gets, who probably didn't have to pay for his copy of the book.
Venn diagram, and I'm right in the...
It's the notion that, not that I learned to, my year with the right, I didn't learn to agree with everything I heard, God knows. But I learned to sort of find common ground and to admire a lot of the people I met, whether I agreed with them or not. And I think that's an increasingly rare concept, at least in sort of the louder, to a certain extent, anyone who's here today is unusual, because most people don't spend their time worrying about these issues. But I think for the people who worries about those issues and talk, and often loudly in social media and media, that notion of sort of assumption of good faith, that we have something to learn from the other side, increasingly rare.
Okay, so I personally, and maybe everyone is deluded into thinking this, but the most exciting thing intellectually for me is encountering opinions I don't agree with and challenging myself. I seek that out all the time. I could list all the conservative podcasts I listen to. I endorse Ben Shapiro on my show just as someone who's, a feisty thinker, let's say, and I got a ton of blowback from the people at Slate because, I do say I disagree with him on most things, and they gave me blowback because he stands for these things. I'm like, yeah, that's why I say I disagree with him. But I kind of admire his, let's just say, his verbal and intellectual metabolism. So I seek this out. I want to challenge. I want to challenge myself. I actually found myself agreeing a lot with a lot of these never-Trumper conservatives, and also agreeing with them.
They're very likable.
Yeah, they're cute and cuddly. Max Boot, who was one, told me that he became a never-Trumper conservative and then started challenging all his conservative worldviews on things like gay marriage. I was like, that's interesting. So we talked about that on my show. So maybe if this isn't a debate, this is a discussion. But if it were a debate, Ken wouldn't be saying, conservatives are people too, and I wouldn't be saying, no, they're not. My point, this is my thesis. Ken was on my show, and The Gist, I'm saying for the cameras, and we talked about this. I don't think the most important thing, or even among the most important things, is that liberals look at conservatives with sympathy or with empathy or try to understand their point. I think we all should do that. That should be just a fact of nature. I think the most important thing right now is that conservatives, in endorsing Donald Trump and in supporting his agenda, and I'll give you some more facts, conservatives are taking this country, including their own children, down a horrible path, and they need to be opposed. They need to be defeated at the ballot box. And if some sort of animosity and enmity drives out the Democratic turnout, that's fine. I'll accept it. I hope we can all maybe simmer down if we get to a future where we have a more sane policy in all these areas. And if Trump is somehow, and I don't say this for emotional reasons, I really worry about things like nuclear war and what he's doing to norms of discourse. I just think it's unbelievably important that Trump needs to be defeated. I think that Republicans in voting for Trump did a horrible thing that should not be empathized with. And I think that now Republicans, in continuing to support Trump, maybe I should feel sorry for them, or maybe there's some ignorance, but mostly I blame them and I fault them. And they can change, and they should change.
Yeah, so it's interesting, and I think you have it. I think you have it backwards, right? Mm-hmm. Trump is a result of the world which we're living in, not the other way around, not the cause. He's adding to it.
Well, I think it's a vicious circle, like you said before.
Yeah, but he would not have won if we did not enter into a world, and we were not already in a world in which both sides hated the other. In fact, you know, in many ways, it was actually a sort of an astonishingly normal election. By and large, the people who voted Republican are people you'd expect to vote Republican. Same for the Democrats, and Trump won because some people who voted for Obama stayed home because they weren't enthusiastic about the Democratic candidate, and a small number of people who voted for Obama switched sides. But probably because that's what happens after 8 years. It's actually a surprisingly normal election. The interesting thing is not that he won the general, it's that he was the candidate of the party, which I agree is a sort of a signal of sort of the decay of the Republican Party. But he would only win in which people were already so angry and polarized that a character who played to that anger would win. So when you say, yes, anger is great because it's going to overturn the guy, I say anger is dangerous because it created the guy.
No, I'm saying that anger among the liberals up to the point where it doesn't veer into racism and it doesn't veer into actual physical threats, that's perhaps a necessary evil to this end. I think, Ken, that you're normalizing an abnormal election. I don't see how you could call an election normal where it set the record for the candidate who won by the greatest percentage of the popular vote. You know, that's happened a few times in our history, but Hillary Clinton won by a greater percentage of vote than anyone who's ever not been elected president. That alone is mind-boggling, and there are dozens of other reasons. Yeah, sure, politics is a game where you turn out your base, that's most of the election, and you try to change a couple other people's minds. So that happened.
No,
that's how it normally happens.
Can I interject here?
Yeah.
That's actually not the interesting. The weird thing about the election is not that someone won the Electoral College and lost the popular vote. That's math. It's happened before, and it'll happen again. And it's either right or wrong, but it's the system.
Well, it's weird if you want to say we live in a democracy. It's weird.
Well, it's a particular type of democracy, right? It's not a direct election democracy. It's an odd 250-year-old set of rules, but it's the set of rules you have till you change them. The unusual part of it was not that Republicans voted for Republicans and Republican leaners voted for Republicans, and same on the Democratic side, and most people stayed home. That's actually pretty typical. The interesting thing was that about Donald Trump was by far the most unpopular candidate of a major party candidate in American history, and Hillary Clinton was second. And he was actually, so they're 1 and 2, and then there's a huge gap to 3 and 4. They're actually fairly close to each other. And that's actually interesting to me, which is how did we get a system in which both parties actually consciously knew they were running super unpopular candidates? And that's the story of the election is Donald Trump is a remarkably unpopular guy, and Hillary Clinton was remarkably unpopular too. And we now have two political parties who are become, I search for the right word, it doesn't really matter what the right word is, so disconnected from the rest of the country in some ways, that they are now producing candidates who are vastly unpopular, and likely going to happen again. I mean, I think what we're seeing is the parties, and Donald Trump is a product of this, but not unique, are producing candidates who are going to not connect with the majority of the country. One of the biggest trends right now going, I've also written for this, for Vanity Fair. You get to plug the gist. I will plug Vanity Fair, which is more people now identify themselves as independents than any time in American history, by far. Far more than think of themselves as Democrats, far more than think of themselves as Republicans. And that's a sea change, and that's because I think the two-party system we have, or the two parties we have, don't work anymore. And that's not just the Republicans, which I think are a train wreck, but the Democrats too.
I think that our system shows that if there's one party whose goal it is to kind of tear down the institutions, they can tear down all the institutions. And I think Norm Ornstein, who works at AEI and has been a centrist all his life, like he says, is a registered Democrat, but he works down the hall from John Sununu for a time, and other registered, very, very conservative guys. He points out, and he's pointed out for 20 years, that it doesn't have to be mutually assured destruction, but he points out that the tearing down of the normal norms of how politics are done and just governing to try to oppose the other side is so disproportionately done by Republicans. And let me say, it's a good tactic. I credit the tactic. It really worked to stymie large parts of the Democratic agenda. I give McConnell and the people who orchestrated that enormous credit. If you take away values and you just look at game theory, using every lever of governance to try to oppose progress from the other team, it works. It's a flaw of our 250-year-old system. This is something that I think they studied extensively at Yale, that in America, too many people have access to the brakes, and the more, the like brakes of a train. The more people who could say no, the more people with veto power, the less good governance you get. But look, it's crazy to think that the last election was normal. There were things about it that were normal. I mean, two white people ran, okay? I guess that's normal. But you know that it wasn't normal. You all know that. No matter what your political stripe, you know that it wasn't normal. Right? Comey doesn't come in and say you're not guilty and cause a huge kerfuffle on the fifth to last day. That just doesn't happen. A guy consistently lies and gets caught in gaffes and pays off a porn star with which all the networks
His lawyer paid him off.
Out of the goodness of time. Like, that's not normal. There's just almost nothing normal about it. And to get back to, if the question is, if the whole premise of your book, you raise a lot of good points, but if the premise of the book is that liberals see conservatives as less deserving of empathy than they are, maybe that's true to some degree, but I would say it's such an original sin to have backed Donald Trump that it's just not deserving in empathy.
See, but the place...
And what you're saying is, no. Before a guy named Trump came along, liberals didn't see...
Every trend I'm talking about.
In 2016, before Trump was elected, they did a poll of Republicans. They did many polls. And 71% doubted if Obama was born in America. And it was equally split between, I don't know, and Kenya. Now, if you want me to have common ground with the other 29%, I could do that. But once you are among the 71% who, what's the nicest thing you could say about them? They watch too much Fox? I mean, it's America. You change the channel. That's 71%. This gets back, we had our debate on our show about Hillary's deplorable comment. There is a deplorability among many conservative Republicans that allowed the Trump thing to happen.
Yeah, we had that argument, right?
Yeah.
That's right. We can reprise it here. So look, I think this is actually a really important point, which is every trend I'm talking about. I mean, yeah, look. I actually wrote this in my book, which is I went out to see a Trump rally in Virginia as soon as he declared, he had some enthusiasm. I wanted to see it before he disappeared because it was insane. Right, that this man was a serious candidate. Are there any Trump supporters? Does anyone dare to be a Trump supporter here? All right. Okay. We can talk about that. It did not strike me that he was, and I've lost my train of thought on this, but he was a.
That threw you.
It
You're
did throw
among
me.
the Trump
It
supporters.
did throw me. But I met, I guess let me actually sort of make a right turn, which is I met a lot of Trump supporters in my year as a Republican, and many of whom I admired. And I think for them, many of them, and I'm actually always curious to hear, especially after a year, especially in a sort of inside of an alien culture here at Yale. For him, a lot of things you complain about, for them, they don't care. He's an instrument, right? They don't.
Sure.
He's not a role model. He's an instrument to reclaiming, what America's about. He's an instrument to shrinking government. Didn't turn out to be the case. He is an instrument to fighting against establishment who had served them so poorly for 30 years. I mean, a lot of the people, you could actually change demographics and you would think differently about this question, but a lot of the people who voted for him, like the white working class, which I think is the sort of the statistical driver of his victory, 30-year losing streak through Democratic administrations, through Republican administrations, through normal elected officials.
Yeah.
Who we would say we agree with or disagree, but we respect. They wanted someone completely different. Could have been Bernie Sanders for a lot of them, but it was Donald Trump in the end. And the number of people who said, Sanders or Trump, it confused me from the beginning. But I think your perspective changes a lot. I think we do not give enough credit to people's really understanding people's perspective. And your perspective comes from a very specific environment, so does mine. But if you're on the south side of the future in Pikeville, Kentucky, I think the calculus looks really different. I don't agree with it because I actually care a lot about the institutions of government, which I think he's undermining. But it's not, I get the reason that people support him in ways that I think I would not if I didn't have the experience I did.
If you were from Appalachia, if you were the machinist from Indiana who's out of work, I could understand a lot of the arguments, right? We need change. Oh my God, this dynasty of Hillary Clinton, and she has a fundamental dishonesty, perhaps criminality. That's not without merit. And, he's definitely a change agent. I also understand, but this takes a lot of motivated reasoning to explain away the parts of what he said that you don't like, but to countenance the part that you liked. And I think that if you made all the people, okay, list the parts you like and list the parts you don't, what's his agenda going to be that you like and what's that he's not, I bet it wouldn't actually match up. Like, I bet a bunch of them were saying things like, let's shrink the size of government, and he definitely hasn't done that. I can understand even saying, I don't care about the morality issue. I don't care about him being cruel, supposedly cruel as the media defines it, to women and minorities. That's not, I'm living a life and death existence here in Indiana, in Pikesville. I get all that. But to me, there are some arguments, and maybe people didn't hear it, but a really compelling argument was the Michael Bloomberg argument, which is look at his track record as a charlatan. And how could he not bring that to the White House? And he certainly seems to. And I listened to the Ben Shapiro argument, which is there are small bits of personality that he doesn't like. Ben's a lot more moralistic traditionally than I am, right? There are small bits of his personality and the tweets and the stuff he says, and let's put up with that because he's delivering the goods. But the goods are that big tax cut and Gorsuch on the Supreme Court. You think your guy in Appalachia cares about those things? You think those things help his life?
No, I think they want their jobs back.
Yeah, and he's not going to get. So that's what I'm saying. Like,
no,
they want their
talk
jobs back. They're charlatan.
But, it's right. So
he's a charlatan. Yeah.
Yeah. So I get that. I mean, maybe. And is it time to open up to questions? Let's go. I think that's a fair final point. I mean, that's a good final point, right? End of the word charlatan, and get questions.
Sure. So just raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Please make sure you speak for the recording, and we'll pass it around. Let's start back here.
Eagles fan behind you?
No, this is WBUR, actually.
Okay, you are.
Yeah. So I was curious, Mr. Stern, you talked about this. What's most troubling to you is the sort of divergent viewpoints. There's two very different visions of the future that you think that parts of the country have. do you see a role in news media in fixing that? Because I'm wondering, how that comes into it. You talked about sort of like the daily story that's getting on, what he's doing wrong or what he's lied about. But is that the role of news media, daily news media, to fix that problem? Or is that something for long-term journalists, something else?
Is it? I think it is all of our, I'll sort of give a cop-out answer. I think it's all of our responsibility. In some sense, I think we're increasingly living in two different worlds. Different vision demographically, economically. I always think of the journalist Ron Brownstein, who sort of as a hobby horse around has sort of been interested in the topic of sort of the majority minority country. And every time I see Ron on TV, he's very good. He's talking about how demographically the country will look, be increasingly urban, it'll be increasingly educated. And I think there's a lot of people in the country who are sitting there saying, wait a minute, I didn't vote for that. And you can agree with them or not, but you have, I think, very different visions of what this country looks like, what it should be, and how it takes care of those who are sort of outside that vision. And I don't think it would that matter if a lot of people weren't doing so poorly. And this gets better to sort of, who created a world in which the 1% are doing so well and the 99% are doing poorly. Maybe it is the Republicans who now are the beneficiaries of some of that electorally. But I think what I see is a lot of people angry about disconnected views of the future because they don't see themselves as being part of that future. And that's a problem.
You're right. The news media, the answer is the news media needs to tell everyone's story and make everyone aware of everyone else's perspective to the extent that people want to pay attention. Yascha Mounk, who teaches at Harvard, points out that post-World War II, median wages doubled in the 25 years after World War II. 25 years after that, they doubled again. And since that period, which is about going on almost 20 years, they've been flat. And that's it. And without material progress, which isn't the job of the news media, maybe it's not anything a politician can deliver. Without material benefits, people begin to doubt democracy. And we're seeing that in polls, and we're seeing more young people saying that living in a democracy is not that important to them. Not a majority, but of the cohorts, millennials denigrate the importance of democracy. And that's one of the reasons we're seeing divergent views. And the other thing I'd say is that negative partisanship, I just want to throw out that phrase because we talked about it and I think you were talking about it. The idea of identifying yourself as being against the other team is absolutely at an all-time high. And it's also, by the way, why I think that, Hillary was the most negative and hated candidate except for Trump. Whoever either party put up there would have been pretty high.
Right.
Would have been underwater, I think.
And
more disapproved than approved.
Right. So I think that's a function of the time. I think we want to make this all about Trump and Clinton, and to a certain extent it is about Trump and Clinton, but I think it's about the times.
Yeah.
That's my shtick to a certain extent is we need to stop understanding this as just an artifice of a couple people. It's actually an artifice of the times. And that's what's scary because I think when they go away, the problems don't get solved. And I think what I say to people is, especially my friends on the left, a lot of the behaviors, the anger that people see are actually quite predictable by economic condition, by changing society, by feeling left behind. You see it all sorts of socioeconomic data. You don't get yourself out of the problem by telling them that they're wrong about their feelings, that they're deplorables, they're clinging to their guns and religion. You do not make progress by telling them that they're wrong. And that's on both sides. One of my favorite shows, so part of my experience was I changed my media mix for a year. Spent a lot of time with Breitbart, listening to conservative talk radio. And one of my favorites, and I put the word favorite in air quotes, was a show called The Wilcow Majority, which you can hear on the Patriot station, Patriot channel on satellite radio, where the host, it's a conservative show, where the host, Andrew Wilcow, 4 times an hour says the show's tagline, "We're right, they're wrong, that's the end of the story." And you don't get very far in a world in which most people think that way. And that's what's, and to me, to go back to your question, I think the news media has a piece of that.
Hello, thanks very much for being here. Fascinating conversation. My question is, do you think that a profit-driven media is compatible with a truth-seeking media? Because I think that for the media, their incentive is to maximize clicks and page views and get as many eyeballs as they can, and most people just want to. I think that they would rather feel right and feel good about what they believe rather than learn the truth. I think most people don't actually care that much about the truth. They just care about feeling right and feeling good about the community they belong to and so on. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are about this, and is there any way to align these two incentives between seeking truth and gaining profit?
Well, I would have used to answer that question differently. But I think Mike started off by, I think, very correctly pointing out the economic incentives of the day. I mean, and again, you have to look at it in historical context. A few years ago, the news media was the failing New York Times. I mean, it was a very, very bad time in news media, except for just a few exceptions. Being loud and angry works really well from a financial perspective. And I don't think that is going to change anytime soon. I mean, I know, for instance, that shows at MSNBC are basically on orders. The only thing you can do is talk about Donald Trump. If there's not a story that's given the thumbs up otherwise, a crisis or sorry to say, a shooting or something like that, you have to cover Donald Trump stories. And that's because that's what draws their audience in, that keeps them tied, keeps them angry, and that's the, that's not just about journalistic importance, that's about keeping the numbers up.
Well, Ken ran NPR, now he writes for Vanity Fair. I work for NPR, now I work for Slate, which is profit-driven, so not always profit-achieving. One was non-profit by choice. We're getting there. I don't think being non-profit helps necessarily, because you want to be popular, you want people to pay attention to you, and if people pay attention to you, especially in pretty good economic times, you'll get some ad dollars. So I don't really see a fundamental disconnect between profitability and great journalism. The argument always used to be that advertisers will weigh, will put their finger on the scale. In my current job, I see almost none of that. I saw more funders, what do you call those?
Underwriters?
Yeah. Well, not the underwriters, the groups who are, the think tanks and the people with the agendas to push. So
you mean like foundation givers?
Foundations. Yeah. Foundations would give would give you $1 million to cover certain issues, and that, I think, skewed your coverage as much as taking advertisements from the local supermarket or auto mall. Yeah, I don't think the profit. And anyway, even if I did think it, there's no changing it.
But I think that's I think that's an important point you make, but I don't think it's...
If an inarticulate one.
I will try to match you, inarticulate word for inarticulate word. I think that it's actually not the identity of the advertisers, it is what's driving clicks. And people know very clearly, I mean, you're much more in this world than I am, so I may be wrong, I'm a dinosaur. But I think right now everyone knows what's driving audience, and what stories do it, and what hot takes. I mean, I've had every sort of lead for a story for Vanity Fair rewritten in a way that's, I won't call it more sensational, but more sort of eye-catching, because that's what works, and that's a different type of coverage, because that's what drives audience, and revenue follows behind. And who doesn't want? I mean, even if it's not revenue, who doesn't want a lot of audience? But the economics are always going to be important on that.
And we haven't said the phrase social media, and that's so important to everything that's going on, because I definitely think there is certainly an intemperance to public discourse now. We used to have just so many more gatekeepers. It was harder for people to get their voices out there. Perhaps at first blush you say, well, that's a bad thing, but it's also a good thing. Remember when the gatekeepers made sure that the people you were listening to actually had credentials or standing to talk about what they're talking about? I mean, of course it's a good and
or
bad.
Or American.
Yeah. I mean, right. Or were the actual, meetup site that was who they said they were, as opposed to a Russian bot. Yeah, so, yeah. Pass the mic, yo.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
First of all, thank you for your time, gentlemen. This is a question for Mr. Pesca. I'm actually curious what's your opinion on Google Newses, right?
On what?
Especially Google News, right?
Google News.
Like the defaults. So something that I've noticed recently is I switched my email account, right? I got rid of my old Gmail. Been in high school, just get rid of all my spam that I've acquired over several years. And I noticed my new account when I'm on Google News the news was totally different. And then I realized I forgot I had changed the settings for which news sources that I was reading. I noticed my new Gmail account, the Google News, every single thumbnail, right? So like even everything from global stories to sports was the Washington Post, right? And I noticed the Huffington Post came out more than Fox News, right? And I'm curious, what do you think that like Google News's role in, I think this is shifting America's opinion to the left in a way, right? Like I think we both agree Washington Post and Huffington Post are leftist news medias. What do you think Google's news role is and responsibility is to be impartial and not, push these more liberal news outlets?
Well, it's certainly I've read different studies, and I remember when people first were noticing that they just kept adding on to the stuff you were already listening to, so that it was this self-perpetuating echo chamber. But then I've read a lot of other studies that kind of said that effect that we got very upset with was a bit overstated. But I definitely think there's a siloing of opinion, either by the algorithm that doesn't care. The algorithm's the honey badger. It don't care. It just wants the clicks. And that's a bad thing. But also we're self-siloing, right? The way Facebook works, and if you rely on getting your news from Facebook, you might subscribe to actually news channels, but then you'll get what other people want to push in your feed. And Facebook just bought Instagram, and now Instagram is going to work to that degree. I mean, I'm always in favor of finding out perspectives and stories that I wasn't exposed to before, but at the same time, I want, a standard of credibility. And it's not always easy to find. Oftentimes, I'll read something in the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal and then go fact check it, and it won't add up. But then sometimes I will, and I will honestly say, well, why isn't this being covered more? And I also think that we really want other people to care about and know about what we care about and know about. But I think when it comes to big things like elections, I mean, that's an ideal. But when it comes to big things like elections, so many people are so different from everyone in this room. And they're what we either call low information voters, or they just go by their gut, or they go by their tribe. And I'm not sure the fine tuning of Google News or your Facebook feed is influencing them as much as these, huge macro trends that we've been talking about.
Yeah. Well, so it's interesting. In what you say, there's a yearning, which I share, that there should be a greater role for sort of the gatekeepers, the people who have somewhat self-appointed role of being the tastemakers for society. And it's hard to argue against that in sort of this angry social media world where I think social media has really driven very negative consequences, lost all sorts of societal problems. I mean, everything from partisanship to suicides. But the thing is, I think the country as a whole, and this is the problem, the country as a whole does not view the news media, especially sort of the mainstream news media, as legitimate tastemakers anymore. I mean, the trust factor for news media is around 35%, roughly equivalent to Donald Trump's, and I don't think that's where the news media wants to be. I think it's basically 2/3 of the country. And they could be entirely unfair, but it's people's view. 2/3 do not view the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, as legitimate tastemakers for them. And that's why I think the system is falling apart.
Yeah, but if you ask people, what about the news media you trust most, you'll get a higher percentage. So yes, some people say, I don't trust the news media, and they're thinking of Fox. And the same person might say, but I do trust MSNBC. I mean, it's like when you ask, what do you think of Congress? It's low. What do you think of your congressman? It's a lot higher. They always say that the Saturday Night Live cast you like most is the one that you saw when you're 14. And maybe it's like that with the whole media. When I was, just starting out in media, it was a time when a blogger like Ezra Klein, just by force of his own brilliance and intellect, could sort of make his name, and that was a good thing. Now we're at a time when, you know, a Mike Cernovich could make his name, but do we really want that name being made? There are a couple things that Cernovich has done that you could say, all right, I'll countenance that. But then there's a whole lot of other things saying, who let this guy dominate my Twitter feed?
So that's my concern is that the first thing I saw, let's say I was 14 years old and made a chemo account for the first time.
Yeah.
I'm seeing all of this liberal news media. And I don't know better because I'm 14, and I still don't know better and I'm 21, right? So, or 22 actually.
Happy birthday.
You know, I'm sorry?
Happy birthday.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was about a month ago.
He just remembered. Yeah.
But
So-
that's my concern is that the first thing that kids, you know, logging on to these news medias are seeing is like generally liberal news media, right? Now, I don't mind liberal news media if it's true, right? But like I think that there's an equal portion of media that's I'll use it fake news and also like real news, right? So that's my concern is that these kids are getting pushed the other way.
But was there ever a time when the media wasn't seen as liberal? I mean, you're conservative now somehow, and 62 million people voted for Donald Trump, and the news media has always been considered liberal. So it wasn't only because Rush Limbaugh started to get a national show in '93 that he changed everyone's minds. I mean, yes, I understand the concern, and I think it's really important I know this was one of the purposes of this talk, and we haven't touched on it. I really think it's important for especially universities and all schools to foster a wide ideology and expose everyone to a bunch of different ideas. But I also think that the concern about the younger generation not being exposed to the truth has probably been with us since there was, a concept of teenager.
One of my rules is that any conversation about American politics has to bring up the name of Tocqueville at some point.
Okay.
So I don't want to put you on the
Do not
spot.
have that rule myself.
My question is simply, what do you all think Tocqueville would make of Trump? And one of the reasons I'm asking is that I think both of you in different ways have rightly pointed to the ways that economic anxieties are affecting a lot of Trump voters. But I think equally important to the story is the way in which so many of the things that Tocqueville predicted would happen in terms of the way democracy has really destroyed mediating institutions, all these ways, these kind of Robert Putnam ways people engage in their communities. And I mean, the very family itself, I mean, the number of people who are married, have kids, these are all at historic lows, US fertility rate, historic low. So I think these social indicators are deeply related to the economic ones and are a huge part of the story that we haven't yet talked about.
Ken, would you like to go first?
A comment on my understanding of de Tocqueville. That will be a short answer. Well, look. I mean, we didn't start with sort of the notion of direct representation and direct elections in this country. I mean, that has changed, and I think some of the, I think our founding fathers might have a very jaundiced view on sort of what the country has become and who's in charge. And that's not just about one side or the other. It's the sense of, there's a whole talk about low information voters, why people vote. I think I think you see some of the reasons why people's faith in democracy are a little bit shaken these days, and I think that's understandable. I don't know you fix it by going back in the other direction, but I do think I think we're at a place where the assumption, sort of the compact of the 20th century, sort of a unique time in American history, that foundation is changing and it's shaking, and the assumptions about whether we're together, who should be in charge, I think those things are all under question now in ways that I would not have guessed when I came of age when I was 14. I came in an age in which the assumption that's the right way to do it. The American version of democracy is the right and only way to do it. It's not perfect, but it is better. It's the worst form of government except for everyone else. I don't think actually people think that anymore, and that's a very different change than 40 years ago or 240 years ago.
I think de Tocqueville would say, so de Tocqueville, what do you think of Trump? And he'd say, cars, the internet. He'd say, porn on the internet. Like, he'd be, oh my God. This guy Trump? I honestly, it's a facetious answer, but I honestly think
So much better
that
than mine.
anyone
Yeah.
from 200 years ago would say, my God, this idea of democracy, look at all the blessings that it's bestowed on the people who bought into it or were born into it. Greg Easterbrook wrote the best nonfiction book I've ever read, The Progress Paradox. Pinker's out with a new book now. Things are great, historically, comparatively great. We have, I do think, the guy who will go down as either the worst president in history or one of the 3 or 4 worst. But but we're gonna overcome that. And we have professionals doing their job who's standing in his way. Yes, so I'm unbelievably optimistic. I do think that we have a bad president and we have bad partisanship, but in terms of, the promise of democracy, few experiments have worked as well as that one has.
So here's what I just learned. If I ever get a question about de Tocqueville again, I'm going to answer porn.
Porn on the internet. That's a little Bill and Ted's answer, right? When they take Franklin Roosevelt to the mall.
Yeah. I believe that was Napoleon to
That's
Waterloo, right?
San
The
Dimas
water
High School
park.
football rules.
Yeah. All right.
Deep cut.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering how you guys think the impact of media focusing so much on the day-to-day outrages is affecting the public's ability to think more long-term about more long-term strategic issues, and how you see the sort of game theory politics of sort of stopping progress because that's what's best for your party is sort of endangering us from really attacking these long-term issues politically.
I mean, it's bad. I think it's dire, and I think all the incentives we talked about are for the immediate. And I think that if you just look at, for instance, the budget deal combined with the tax cuts that were just passed, look, I mean, people will talk about, the gut reactions, but to me, having a debt that's at, 100, maybe 100, maybe 98, maybe 102% of GDP, for the next time a recession comes, and then there'll be no wiggle room to spur the economy then, and we'll look back and said, what were they thinking? I mean, we're thinking about going on to the next thing. This is one of the fundamental problems with a democracy versus an autocracy where they, or any other form of government where they think they're going to be there for a while. You're always incentivized to work in the short term. And then when the media perpetuates that, it's really bad and really dangerous. And as much as I'm sanguine about how well we've, everything we've achieved in 200 years, some of the worst things that we've done are not pre-planned because, senators are elected every 6 years, but Congress is elected every 2, and governors are elected every 4, and no one has that long-term vision. I think if there was really an infrastructure plan, like a real one, that really funded, I live in New York, we totally need another tunnel. Chris Christie, there's a great example. I just thought of this. Chris Christie gets dinged for all those short-term things he did. Bridgegate was a scandal every day, and then he's sitting on the beach that he closed. But the absolute worst thing, the most immoral thing the guy ever did, was cancel that ARC tunnel and not put anything in to replace it. If you want to say there are cost overruns, fine. But you need to address the health of New York and New Jersey for the next 30 years. And he just put a big monkey wrench in there. And I guess the people who pay attention to politics know that that's wrong. But that's so much worse than closing a bridge for one day.
So I think we live in a world of outrage. Everyone is angry all the time. Every action from either side is worthy of outrage. I mean, that's sort of the nature of media and social media, right? Whatever Trump does, people are going to be super angry about that. And it's not the case that everything he does is worthy of you may disagree with it, but not everything his administration does is insensible or an outrage. And the same is true for President Obama from the conservative side. But what that does, I mean, I think one is it drives everyone insane. How you actually survive, how we're going to survive 4 or 8 years of this is beyond me. But it raised the costs of compromise. And I think politicians are increasingly trained. They're, we talked about how the media is trained by money. Politicians are trained by votes and voter approval. They're increasingly trained that compromise is bad. and in the end, we get the government we get because of that. And I think media has a part of that by being outraged at what the other side is doing, and that drives behaviors from voters and politicians alike. I think it's ultimately enormously destructive. We saw that today. I mean, actually, we actually had a bipartisan group of senators get together and work out a compromise. On the math, it should have been enough, but they got beaten down on it. And
DACA, you mean?
I mean the immigration deal.
Yeah. Non-deal. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So something happened that never happens. A bipartisan group of senators got together and came up with a plan, and got blasted by the president, but others as well, and it went down pretty fast.
Let me ask you a question. We'll do lightning round. Tell me if this was an outrage. President Trump's comments on shithole countries. Do you think that was an outrage?
Yes, I do think that was an outrage.
The John Kelly handling of the Rob Porter.
Do I think yes?
Or just Rob Porter being in the White House?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. This is a lightning round. Okay.
Yeah,
But it's a fairly selective lightning round.
No. Trump's idea to have a military parade.
Oh yeah, that's an outrage.
Okay.
But by the way, it's never going to happen.
Okay, but what I'm saying is, yes, everything's an outrage, but I'm just giving, the Stormy Daniels payoff.
But I could give you other,
But if everything, I know the idea is everything's an outrage. I'm nodding, I'm like, yeah, everything shouldn't be an outrage. But I gave you 4 stories in the last week that are legitimately outrageous.
Yeah, well, I mean, but again, I'll say it didn't start, I mean, it's such an outlier person, but in some ways he's, I'm going to argue against myself. He's an outlier person, so by personality, I mean, he's elected because he's outrageous.
Yes.
I guess what is one man's outrage is another man's entertainment.
That's true.
Or rejection of norms. And I think we got to understand that. I think the problem is we're constantly chasing these daily stories. And I get it. I mean, they're also fascinating and like, a car wreck. But they're also not the only story and not the most important story. And I think they push out things that are, more important, and they push out things that are not, immigration views are actually pretty complicated. Gun control issues are pretty complicated. Paris being part of the Paris Climate Agreement, which was uniformly described as being an outrage, it's actually not an outrage. You don't have to agree with it, but it's not an outrage. And there are a lot of, I think, sensible people, whether Trump is one of them, or that's a different issue, but there are a lot of sensible people on both sides of the issue. And I think we tend to start lumping the substantive stuff in with the craziness of it all.
But I don't know, as someone who reports the news, if the right answer is the 4 things I just said in the last week to pay less attention to them. Like, isn't that normalizing them?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
So I was wondering, when Bush was president, I think that a lot of the liberal media couched a lot of their rhetoric against him in terms of he's a fundamental threat to American democracy.
Yes.
And got really...
Doesn't he seem wonderful, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Alarmist. And then when Obama was president, I think that a lot of the center-right and the right-wing media did the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Really got alarmist about it. Now we have a president who does present a more fundamental threat, but I think that a lot of the language coming from the leftist media does not ring true because they used it before and they used it incorrectly. And then if, let's say, some sort of left-wing president with the same threat that Trump poses comes along and the right-wing media wants to criticize them in that same type of language, I don't think that criticism would be effective either. So do you think we've kind of now had a boy who cried wolf, essentially, in terms of calling presidents much bigger threats than they were, in a way that now people are not going to be able to comprehend threats that people do actually pose because they've seen the media get too hyper-aware of something that they didn't need to?
It's a good question. I hear it with race, too. I mean, I hear people say, people called Bush a racist and people called Mitt Romney a racist. People did call that. You ask most voters who voted for Mitt or didn't vote for Mitt, how racist is the guy? I think they would say, oh, yeah, what's the case for racism? Oh, what, he named his ranch or something? Like, there'd be no real case. Yes, we could all pull up 100 articles that maybe bunch of them from Salon or someplace, or the Huffington Post, and they said that this is why he's fundamentally racist. But it's not true. When it is true, I do think it resonates more. I think the fundamental threat to democracy of Trump is resonating a lot more than it was with Obama because it's a lot truer. I don't think that we saw all these esteemed people on the left breaking off from the Democratic Party during the Obama administration. I don't think we saw esteemed people on the right breaking with Bush for whatever was said to be his threat to democracy. I mean, what was it? Signing statements that Ari Fleischer said, "We're watching you." I don't know. I think that, first of all, one thing about democracy is that we have very few solid data points. So it might be the case, and I sound stupid because during the election I thought Trump wouldn't win and said so, but it might be the case that the Republicans really lose the midterms and he either gets impeached or something, or loses badly. And then won't we be saying, well, it was said that he was a threat to democracy and enough of the people took that seriously. And that'll be different from Bush and Obama. Do you understand what I'm saying?
So I think the answer to your question is yes. And I think Mike overstates the impact of the media because the only people who listen to media, you only listen to media you agree with. Donald Trump, whatever you think of the last year, spent a lot of time talking about it, his approval rating today is exactly the same it was on the day he was elected. Now, no one has changed their minds.
Well, it's 4 or 6 points lower.
No, it was 38% the day after the election.
You took the approval rating versus what his actual percent of the vote was.
Yeah, so yes, approval rate, right. So, I mean, more than 40% of people would vote. If his approval rating today is 38%, he would get more than 38% because he would get some people who vote for him because they approve him.
But I think his net approval is 5 points lower or so than when he was elected. But we could go back.
Yeah, I mean, I believe if you do go back, his actual approval, the people who actually say they approve of Donald Trump, I mean, it's gone up and down and went up, around the inaugural, but it is, I believe, almost identical to the day he got elected. And you wonder what the impact of it is of sort of a year of, angry coverage of him. I think the net of it all is really not much. And that's because we have sort of the confirmation bias. People who want to agree with him don't listen to those who disagree with him. And that's to me, it's actually a constitutional crisis, not Donald Trump, but the fact that we are so balkanized and don't listen to each other, because that means if he's a real threat to democracy, people aren't hearing it.
One last question. I'd like to back up to the beginning of your comments and to challenge the characterization of some of the media outlets, and I'll do that by telling a quick story. I retired 5 years ago, but before that I shared an office. I'm an arts administrator. I shared it with another arts administrator, and she liked to listen to NPR, and she liked to listen to it real loud, which is another problem.
Just crank it to 11.
Crank it. And I found in being forced to listen to it that they weren't covering the whole story. Whatever the story was, whatever the topic was, that I knew the other side, or I knew a more balanced presentation of the subject than I ever heard. And I finally just asked her, I couldn't get my work done because I was so angry all the time. So it's true that I am a Fox listener, watcher, and I believe that I get balanced viewpoints. There are a few strongly opinion shows, but most of the shows really present both viewpoints, present people representing many points of view, not just one or the other, but a balance of viewpoints. So I reject your characterization of Fox and NPR, frankly.
Do you have a specific story that you remember?
Do you remember any bad stories by Mike Pesca, by any chance? They were gold. I want to tell you, they were all gold.
Balance, fair and balance of the Fox motto. Fairness is an ideal to strive for, and balance is not necessarily. And often when it comes to something like the Nunes memo, I mean, I really, really looked into the both sides argument, and it seems like I just think that the NPR coverage will give you a much better view on how to contextualize something like that. And I watch a lot of Hannity, and it seems like he is a... I wouldn't use that as an example. Meaning you think the Nunes memo coverage is, oh, you wouldn't use Hannity as an example. You wouldn't use Hannity as an example. By far the most popular show on Fox.
Well, he's an opinion person.
Right, so which show on Fox?
Laura Ingraham, would you use?
No.
Tucker
You mean
Carlson.
Tucker or?
Well,
Those are the three most popular shows. Those shows add those viewers together. It equals the viewership of most of the Fox.
So what show on Fox do you admire? For its even.
there are a lot of them. I'll use the 6 o'clock special report as
Is that Brett Baer? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's to me a show. The ones that they define as news, more, although they do define Fox and Friends as news, asterisk, all morning shows are kind of silly. But the ones they define as news adhere more to my ideal. I want a right, conservative, fantastic National Review or Weekly Standard of the air. Like, I'd love that. But to me, that's, and some of the Fox News shows approach that. I think.
So I have a complicated relationship with media these days. But I will tell you, and I spent lots of time watching Fox and lots of time reading National Review, and like you, I sort of admire the hell out of their coverage or their writing. But you know what? I think as much as I have to say critiques of the Post, the Times, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, they do by far the best reporting there is. And you know what? Fox is reading and watching them as well to get the stories. Everyone is, because they have a different role in the news media than others. And I'm not going to. I've heard had a lot of thoughtful conversations about people who feel locked out of the media, feel they don't tell the whole story. And that's, I think, a little bit of the challenge. Everyone has a different take on it. But there's a difference. There's a quality difference. There is a investment in actual reporting. We wouldn't know what's going on in the world in the same way as we do if it weren't for those institutions. And that's not to say they're right. They're worlds of human construct. They are self-perpetuating, hiring people who think like them. I think there's all sorts of subconscious bias in it. But I think that's very different than the Hannitys and others of the world. And I know that wasn't your point. But they're institutions that are really very important to the country.
And I could understand being driven crazy by NPR. We both left.
Let's give a round of applause to our guests this evening.
Thank you, guys.